From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. What's up with you today, David?
Well, I was reading Ralph's column this week, and there's some good news in the Associated Press today, Ralph. It says columnist Michael Gerson and commentator Amy Holmes are teaming to start a conservative-oriented talk show on PBS. It's called In Principle. So we're going to get the right wing's view now for civil discourse on the PBS. That's good news, right?
Except that it's nothing new. You know, the colloquial name for PBS has been Petroleum Broadcast System years ago. And I don't think they need more right-wing talk shows on PBS. I mean, the airways are completely dominated by Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and Levin and Savage. Now they want more on NPR. But that's for another show, a critique of NPR and PBS.
Well, that voice you've heard, if you don't know it already, is the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Welcome, Ralph. We've got a great show today.
We have a show that's going to show the real divide in this country, far, far more serious than liberal versus conservative or red state, blue state. It's the divide between real human beings and the artificial entities called giant corporate multinationals, the corporations who are moving toward immunity and impunity for the corporations, not just for their shareholders, as well as for their corporate executives.
That's right. Regular listeners to this show know that Ralph is always comparing crime in the streets to crime in the suites, and how street crime is always punished more severely than corporate crime. Well, on today's show, we are going to welcome Jesse Eisinger, a journalist and author who writes for ProPublica, which is a nonprofit newsroom that produces investigative journalism. His book is entitled The Chicken Shit Club: Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. We're going to do a deep dive into all the rationalizations and excuses for why that happens, or in this case, doesn't happen. And later in the show, as always, we'll get our own weekly corporate crime report from our very own Russell Mokhiber. And at the end, we'll knock out some of your listener questions. But first, let's find out why corporate executives get off so easily. David?
Jesse Eisinger is an award-winning senior reporter and editor at ProPublica. He and a colleague won the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting for a series of stories on the questionable Wall Street practices that helped make the financial crisis the worst since the Great Depression. The book we're going to be discussing today is his latest, The Chicken Shit Club: Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Jesse Eisinger.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, let's get right into the title of your book, which comes from a very private meeting between the new U.S. Attorney for the District of Manhattan, James Comey, who later became FBI director and then was fired by Donald Trump. But one of his first meetings with the attorneys in his office, what happened?
Yeah, this is going back to 2002. He had just been appointed U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. And the Southern District, you have to understand, the Department of Justice is 94 offices around the country, most of them led by a U.S. Attorney. Then there's Washington, led by the Attorney General. And U.S. attorneys are unto themselves. They think of themselves as really kind of people who want to ignore Washington as much as possible, and so they really are kind of ship's captains. And Comey was a towering figure, kind of literally at that point, 6'7", and he gathers all these people together. And in the Southern District of New York, they think of themselves as the hot shots, the best of the best, the elite trial lawyers of the country, and the best prosecutors in the land. And so he gathers all the criminal prosecutors together, and he says, I want to make a few remarks before we get started. And if you guys have followed Comey's career or followed him, listeners probably have seen him since he got fired by Donald Trump. He likes to hear himself talk. He's certainly no stranger to the spotlight and likes it. So he begins by saying, well, how many of you guys have never lost a case? And a bunch of these hands shoot up because they're very proud of their record and they're so And these go-getters think of themselves as so good at this, and he looks around the room and he says, well, me and my buddies have a name for you guys. You're the Chicken Shit Club. And the hands go down and they slump in their chairs. You're probably for the first time since third grade. And they're listening, and what does Comey mean by that? Well, he means that your job is not about winning. It's certainly not about winning at all costs. It's not about racking up an undefeated record. Your job is about doing justice. And doing justice requires ambition. It requires going after the biggest, most significant wrongdoers in the country. And sometimes you will lose those cases, and that's okay. That sometimes a point can be made by the government bringing a difficult case, an ambitious case against a significant or important or powerful wrongdoer. And my argument in the book is that over the subsequent 15 years to today, 16 years now, the Department of Justice has become the Chicken Shit Club writ large when it comes to top corporate executives from the largest companies in the country. We do not prosecute them anymore. We have done a better job in the past. I'm sure we'll talk about that. But today we do a very poor job, and there's been a collapse in this kind of prosecution.
And we're in a corporate crime wave, whether it's the drug companies, the oil companies, the banks, insurance companies. They are getting away with criminal or criminogenic behavior, civil fraud, billing fraud, for example. Look at your credit card situation, invasions of privacy. They tie you up in fine print contracts. They keep you from going to court with compulsory arbitration agreements. But you said they don't do this anymore. That is prosecuting, and that's what I want to ask you, because back in the 1980s, with the savings and loan scandal, thousands of them failing in a high-interest environment, they couldn't make it, but there were a lot of shenanigans. What was the Justice Department and the Securities Exchange Commission and the banking agencies doing then by comparison? Then we'll compare this amazing decline in law and order and law enforcement vis-a-vis these corporate crooks today.
Well, they did a better job. Now, I don't think there's ever been I say in my book, there's never been a golden age where the rich and powerful really had to fear for their liberty if they committed crimes. But there have been silver ages, and we have done a significantly better job in past busts. And the savings and loan scandal, as you say, we prosecuted over 1,000 individuals, many of the top executives from the biggest financial institutions that were involved in that crisis. And that was because the Justice Department and the regulators put an enormous amount of resources into investigating and prosecuting those crimes, and they focused on individuals. And there are other examples of this. In the wake of the junk bond scandal in the 80s, right around the same time as the savings and loan scandal, they prosecuted arguably the most powerful figure on Wall Street at the time, Michael Milken. They also prosecuted partners at Goldman Sachs. They brought a Goldman Sachs trader off the trading floor in handcuffs. They prosecuted lawyers associated with that scandal. In the wake of the Enron, WorldCom, Adelphia, Tyco, those accounting scandals of the late 1990s and early 2000s, a kind of pandemic of accounting fraud, they prosecuted almost all the top executives from almost all the big companies that were implicated in those scandals. And then, in the wake of the financial crisis, there were no top bankers from large banks involved in the financial crisis who were prosecuted personally. And that was the thing that got me so puzzled and outraged, and why I wrote the book.
And not only you, but the vast majority of the American people. The polls show 90% of the people want to break up the big banks that are too big to fail. And that means a lot of conservatives and liberals and all kinds of political persuasions. But in your book, we're talking with Jesse Eisinger. He has written this book, The Chicken Shit Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. And the distinction is indictment and then a trial compared to negotiating a deal between these corporations and their corporate law firms. And so I want to read just a section from your introduction, Jesse, and I'm quoting, quote, Since 2001, more than 250 federal prosecutions have involved large corporations. These include some of the biggest names in corporate America: AIG, Google, JP Morgan Chase, and Pfizer among them. The majority of these have been negotiated deals, not indictments. From 2000 through the fall of 2016, the Justice Department entered into 419 such settlements called deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements with corporations. End quote. Why don't you discuss this incredible ability of these corporate law firms to maneuver Justice Department lawyers, who don't have the biggest budgets and the greatest number of lawyers, into these non-prosecution agreements or deferred prosecution?
Yeah, so what has replaced prosecuting individual executives, prosecuting CEOs and chair people of the corporations are these negotiated settlements. Now, one of the things is the prosecutors say, well, these aren't negotiated settlements, they're actually prosecutions. And so the nomenclature is a little bit different, but really what they are is the corporation writes a check and a piece of paper is put in a drawer by the prosecutors, and the prosecutors say, well, we could prosecute you, but we're not going to for now, and we want to watch you to see if you behave yourselves. And now my argument is that this has replaced the prosecutions of individuals and that this fundamentally does not work. It is a regime that is broken. And the reason we know it doesn't work is that we see recidivist corporations. We see corporations breaking rules repeatedly and getting sanctioned and then breaking them again. The JP Morgan, Pfizer, BP, these companies, many other companies, are recidivists. They have broken rules and been accused of crimes and sometimes pled guilty to crimes over and over again and still commit wrongdoing. So this is a regime that just does not work.
Well, this is the old saying, corporate crime pays. Even when they have to fork over $500 million or $1 billion by a drug company for promoting unapproved uses for their drugs, which can severely harm people. Pfizer was involved in that. Even if they paid those fines, they made more money before they were caught to begin with. And that's why University of Virginia law professor Brandon Garrett put out a study saying, quote, over 50% of the most serious fraud and larceny culprits were recidivists, about the same as robbery and firearms offenders and far higher than drug traffickers, end quote. And, he refers to BP, the British oil and gas company, ExxonMobil, Pfizer. They're repeatedly subject to these non-prosecution agreements or even convictions, and they come back again and again because the corporate entity shields the executives, right? The bosses at the top.
Well, it shouldn't necessarily shield them, but it happens to do so. The reason why I think it shouldn't is that there's nothing legally keeping prosecutors from investigating these people. They just don't do it anymore. So, and, I relied very much on Brandon's work. He's a really smart guy who's looked at this and then tried to explain what has happened here. And so it is absolutely true that these companies are recidivists. It's absolutely true that we don't deter corporate crime. And my argument is that we would deter corporate crime by prosecuting individuals. And I think that really you alluded to this earlier, but we do not treat street criminals like this. We prosecute individuals for street crime, and we do not worry about the collateral consequences or the failures of the businesses or the problems with their families when we prosecute a drug dealer or murderer. But large executives, top executives for large corporations have impunity. And my argument is that this is a threat to the basic contract that we have with our country, the legitimacy of our democracy, that we cannot have impunity for a certain class of people and remain a fair society. And I think you see that the public understands this. They might not understand the nuances of a deferred prosecution agreement, but they understand that people are getting away with it and that it's unfair, and they're angry about it. And I think it contributed to some extent to Donald Trump's election.
Well, they understand it better than we do, I think. When they say they get away with it, I mean, they see, for example, people with a little marijuana or half ounce of cocaine being put away for years, and then they see these drug companies pushing these opiates recklessly and getting away with it, making tons of money. In fact, just recently, the state of Ohio has filed a lawsuit against one or more of these drug companies for this kind of reckless marketing, and knowing that it leads to an epidemic of deaths. I think there are more than 1,000 deaths in America now a week from these opiates, and it keeps growing. And so people see this double standard. The lawyers in their fancy three-piece suits, figuring out a way to get their corporation or their corporate boss client off. And this is something they see day in and day out. The rich escape the law, and the poor have to pay the price for breaking the law.
Yeah.
And so I want you to go a little deeper in this, Jesse, because in your book you say, quote, "But the most valuable perquisite corporate officers possess is the ability to commit crimes with impunity. Such injustice threatens American democracy. Today, the justice system is broken," end quote. And of course, we have the whole terrible situations in our prisons and the criminal injustice system and prosecutorial abuse and police overreach that have been in the news. What exactly do you mean when you say it threatens American democracy? Is it just a threat to American democracy, or has it been over the recent decades actually eroding it? Can you be more specific?
Well, I do think it is eroding it, and I think that it undermined Obama's credibility when they tried to respond to the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, and that the Democratic Party, which has kind of been captured by technocratic interests, also corporate interests and big money interests, but really kind of had an ethos that they should have kind of specific and tailored and very intelligent and carefully engineered reforms of the financial system, and they thought that prosecuting individuals was kind of mob justice. And you saw Timothy Geithner, the Treasury Secretary, have disdain for the mob and say, "We're not looking for Old Testament justice," he said. So I think that they had this very dismissive view of prosecutions. And instead they initiated the Dodd-Frank financial reform, which is, I think, woefully inadequate for this. And the reason why it was inadequate was that it was not coupled with prosecutions of individuals. So it undermined the legitimacy of those reform efforts. And in fact, what I thought was that if you had coupled that with prosecutions, which were warranted, there should have been dozens and dozens of bankers who were prosecuted in the wake of the financial crisis, if not hundreds, including, I believe, top executives. If you had coupled that with that, one, the Dodd-Frank reform would have been perceived as stronger. But the more important point, and I'm sure that this is true, although it's counterfactual, is that you would have had a much more significant financial reform. You might have had a breakup of the big banks, which I think is necessary, or something along those lines which had been significant. So people did not believe in the Obama reforms. It undermined his presidency and faith in his presidency. And then it undermined Hillary Clinton's campaign. When Hillary Clinton campaigned on a more serious reform effort and, in fact, occasionally flirted with breaking up the banks, nobody believed her. And she gave those speeches at Goldman Sachs, and so they thought that she was in the pocket of Goldman. And then, conversely, you had Donald Trump arguing that he was not in the pocket of anybody and that Ted Cruz and Hillary Clinton were in the pocket of Goldman. And he ran against bankers and against Wall Street. Now, that was a con job because when he got into office, he immediately installed Goldman Sachs bankers in many positions of power and now has been reversing regulations even from the Obama era, specifically with financial interests, but almost across the board.
I might say, Jesse, is one of the fastest betrayals in American presidential history.
I mean
hardly had he gotten in the White House when he started inviting Goldman Sachs alumni, including his leading advisor, who was head of Goldman Sachs, to go right into the White House. This is the difference, listeners, between political talk and political deed. And I think if more voters would just focus on that, okay, politician, what have you done compared to what you say you've done, etc., we'd have a much healthier electoral system for sure. But you're right, nobody believed Hillary Clinton because she was taking $250,000 a speech. I broke it down to $5,000 a minute, Jesse, behind closed doors, and she had insisted on a transcript to be done, paid for by the bank client, and she wouldn't release the transcript. And Trump hammered her again and again on this. This is the kind of corporatist populism that Trump has succeeded in persuading all too many people in this country. Let's go into this aspect of your fascinating book. And by the way, every library listener should have this book. That's the way more people can read it. And you might want to give it as a gift to your local library. You say, I'm quoting you, defaulting to a settlement with a corporation without prosecuting individuals corrodes the rule of law. Settlement culture validates the critiques of both sides. Companies argue that the government has extorted them into forking over money for unproven crimes. They say they cannot contest allegations because regulators hold the power of life and death over them. The public, meanwhile, sees corporations writing checks to make these charges disappear, end quote. You want to elaborate on that one?
Yeah, sure. So, I sympathize more with the public's critique of this, that the corporations are getting away with it and writing checks. But I do think that on occasion, these sort of right-wing critiques or the defense bar critiques are true, which is that they're kind of extortionists. And the reason is that we just don't know. We don't know what the investigations are. We don't know what the charges are. We don't know why the outcomes were reached because there has been no public trial. And these negotiated settlements hide the details of the investigations, hide the allegations. Often the government puts out a statement of facts that both parties ostensibly agree to, and they're quite anodyne, and they're very negotiated by the high-priced lawyers. And the aspect of the book that I regard as a big contribution, or I would like to think as a contribution, is the analysis of how these agreements are reached, which is that the dirty secret of corporate law enforcement in America is that we have outsourced and privatized it. The prosecutors now enlist the corporations to investigate themselves. So this is akin to kind of asking Pablo Escobar whether he's running a drug cartel. And so what Pablo Escobar would do if he were an American corporation is hire the biggest law firm in Medellin. So American corporations hire a law firm, and the law firm is working for them. And then the corporation does an internal investigation. And these internal investigations are, of course, done in a very professional way with an enormous amount of resources. They look very serious. They look adequate. And then they're handed to the prosecutors and the Department of Justice. And the prosecutors, of course, can do further investigation, but they're often overwhelmed and too busy, and they've got too many cases. So they essentially read this internal investigation and come to the conclusions that the internal investigation came to. Now, the internal investigations are, as you can imagine, studiously incurious about culpability at the top. They're not looking at the CEO. They're not looking at the chairman. They're not looking at the CFO. If they do finger an executive, it's a lower middle-level person who they can throw under the bus. And now, who are the prosecutors? Well, the prosecutors are future defense attorneys at the very same law firms. What happens is most prosecutors are relatively young, in their late 20s or early 30s, and they're going to work as they're aspiring to become partners at big law firms that do corporate defense work. So there's a terrible revolving door problem. It's not the only problem here, but it's a significant one, and that's the way these are negotiated.
Indeed, it's even higher than that. Tell our listeners about the back and forth of Attorney General Holder under Barack Obama with Covington and Burling.
Yes, well, that's exactly it. Holder was Deputy Attorney General under Bill Clinton and Janet Reno, and after he had worked his way up through the bureaucracy of the DOJ, he then went to a law firm called Covington and Burling. And you know Covington and Burling because your colleague and I relied on this in my book, who wrote a book called The Other Government in the 70s about
Mark Green.
Mark Green wrote a wonderful book about the secret power of these influential Washington law firms, and Covington and Burling plays a major role in that book and continues to be a very quiet, genteel firm that is extremely powerful in the halls of Washington, D.C. And so he joins Covington and becomes a very high-priced, high-paid partner there, and then goes to become Obama's first attorney general and oversees the response to the financial crisis prosecutions, which I think is one of the biggest scandals of the Obama administration, a woefully inadequate response where they, as I've said, and we'll say again and again, and everybody knows, didn't prosecute a single top banker. And then, well, he left the administration. Where does he go? He goes to Covington and Burling, back to Covington and Burling, where now he's representing corporations. And so there's a significant revolving door. Who was Obama's head of the Securities and Exchange Commission? Well, she was a former U.S. attorney named Mary Jo White, who actually was the U.S. attorney in the Southern District right before Jim Comey. And after she was at the Southern District, she went to be a defense attorney at Debevoise and Plimpton, the big New York corporate defense firm. And then she went to become the head of the SEC, and now she's returned back to Debevoise and Plimpton. So you can imagine that this is a problem that is repeated throughout the government at almost every level of the Department of Justice in Democratic administrations and Republican administrations. And this is a significant problem for bringing culpable executives to justice in America.
I want to ask you, Jesse, about the chapter you have in your book called Jed Rakoff's Radicalization. And I want to preface it by a couple sentences from your book. Quote, "Corporate power is at a zenith in America, and business has privileges not seen since the Gilded Age. Executives make more money than ever. Corporate profits are at record highs. The courts are expanding corporate rights as companies exert great political power and dominate our policy discourse," end quote. And just recently, the New York Times reported that the big corporations are going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars buying back their stock instead of putting the money into productive investment, research and development, shoring up their pension funds, raising their salaries of their workers like Walmart. They're increasing the hundreds of billions of dollars in buying back their stock because that's one of the criteria, higher stock prices for their own compensation packages for the bosses. And of course, in your book, you also say that when these companies pay these settlement figures with the Justice Department, the hundreds of millions of dollars, for example, the drug companies have paid, it's the shareholders that pay for that sum. And the shareholders are powerless, violating a key rule of fundamental capitalism, which is if you own something, you should have control over something that you own. Into this picture comes Judge Rakoff. Why don't you describe his experience?
Sure. Jed Rakoff was a young prosecutor in the Southern District of New York under a lion of the defense bar now, but used to probably one of the best U.S. attorneys ever, Bob Fisk. And back then, it didn't occur to them to prosecute corporations, certainly not to settle with them. That didn't exist. They prosecuted individuals. And the Fisk's ethos, and before him was Robert Morgenthau, who was really a legend, who was the district attorney in Manhattan for decades, but before that was the U.S. attorney in the Southern District. They believed that they needed to prosecute white-collar crime, and they had to prosecute the most powerful actors and raise their sights. So they prosecuted attorneys who helped white-collar criminals, and they prosecuted accountants, and they went after CEOs, and they did not settle with corporations. That was what Jed Rakoff learned. And Jed Rakoff then became a defense attorney, working for high-profile corporate clients sometimes, and then he became a judge. And he's a district court judge, and he's one of the freest-thinking, iconoclastic, most outspoken judges. And in the wake of the financial crisis, a case came before him where Merrill Lynch had been taken over by Bank of America. The investment bank Merrill Lynch had been taken over by Bank of America in the height of the financial crisis. And then Bank of America and Merrill Lynch executives lied about key aspects of the deal to the public and to the shareholders. They lied that Merrill Lynch was losing money. They misrepresented how much it was losing, understating the losses, and they lied that they were going to pay huge bonuses to Merrill Lynch executives despite that they had racked up all these losses. And the government investigated. And then the Securities and Exchange Commission investigated, and the case came before Rakoff, and they had negotiated a settlement, and the settlement was absurdly low. The amount of money was something like $31 million originally, a tiny, minuscule amount for the kind of audacious misrepresentation that Judge Rakoff thought might potentially be a crime or could be investigated as a crime. And so he did something unprecedented. He rejected the settlement. Now, most judges just rubber stamp these things, and he himself had rubber stamped them because they're not interesting cases. He sort of wanted to get on to the more interesting stuff and in the past, but this time he couldn't. And so he rejected the settlement. And this started a kind of small revolution in the judiciary. It's called getting Rakoffed now, when judges look askance at these negotiated settlements from the SEC and the DOJ and say, no, this is inadequate, and the facts and circumstances and the wrongdoing here call for something else. And a bunch of judges have rejected settlements, and Judge Rakoff himself rejected another one negotiated with Citigroup. But unfortunately, he kind of won the battle in some ways. The SEC kind of changed its policies and tries not to do it as much, and occasionally gets people to admit wrongdoing, but in fact he sort of lost the war. He got overturned by a very corporate-friendly appeals court, the Second Circuit, and now that's kind of back to doing business the old-fashioned way, which is to settle with companies for money, although in fact under the Trump administration and Sessions DOJ it's even worse.
What do you see going in the future here with the Supreme Court 5-4 usually protecting corporate criminal cases? What do you see in Congress? Congress, of course, is gridlocked, but the Democrats aren't breaking new records in campaigning around the country for votes, talking about cracking down on corporate crime, law and order for corporate criminals, crime in the suites. What do you see other than just an increasing immunity and impunity by both these giant corporations and their corporate bosses?
I mean, sadly, I don't see any improvement. In fact, I see things getting worse. And, anybody coming to my book who likes happy endings should probably leave the book in the library or on Amazon or wherever they get their books, because there's not a happy ending here. The Jeff Sessions DOJ, I'm very
Department of Justice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Justice Department. I'm very critical of Obama and Eric Holder in my book. I think that they did a very poor job, that it's a scandal, but I think that the Sessions Justice Department is going to be an order of magnitude worse, and you're already seeing an even greater collapse of regulatory actions against corporations and fines and sanctions from the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission under Jay Clayton, who is Trump's SEC commissioner chair, and you're seeing the DOJ not bringing these kinds of cases. So even though white-collar prosecutions were at a 20-year low under the Obama Department of Justice, we're going to see an even greater collapse now. This is not going to be a priority. Instead, the Sessions Department of Justice is going after low-level, nonviolent drug offenders, illegal immigrants. Those are the kinds of priorities, and white-collar crime is not going to be a priority.
Well, before we see light at the end of the tunnel, which I want to talk to you about, it's going to get worse. There's just an internal memo in the Trump administration leaked to the press, which recommended that the federal government try to override or preempt state prosecution of student loan rackets in these private universities and all the criminality that's been involved affecting young Americans who are deeply in debt.
Indeed.
And also, you have the House of Representatives last year under the Republicans passed 5 bills eroding the ability of the American people to have their day in court and trial by jury if they're wrongfully injured, otherwise known as tort reform in my syntax. They call it tort reform. So they even want to repeal the American Revolution, which in no small part was based on getting out from under King George III who wanted to restrict their rights to their local courts and trial by jury. Now, let's see what would happen if Bernie Sanders or if presidential candidates, congressional candidates already were seeing it in some congressional races. They start making corporate criminality, business crimes, business fraud on your Medicare, for example, fraudulent extensions of credit criteria, redlining poor areas by banks and insurance companies, and just generally billing fraud, which one expert at Harvard said just in the healthcare area alone, it's 10% of all health expenditures, which comes down to $350 billion this year in billing fraud and abuse in the healthcare industry. So, I mean, there's a lot of interface with the daily lives of the American people that candidates running for office, local, state, and national, can really make this a big issue, as long as they free themselves from the campaign money that comes from these corporate sources. It's a vote getter. What do you think of the prospects there?
Well, I am very confused about why politicians don't pick up this mantle. I think that there's a lot of anger toward corporations and corporate crime, both on the right and the left, and that people could tap into this. And you saw glimmers of this when a senator from Ohio, Sherrod Brown, teamed up with David Vitter, who was a senator from Louisiana, about reining in some of the big banks. And there's an alliance to be made there between the coasts, not the coastal elites, but kind of, Southern Republicans and Midwestern Democrats about reining in the big banks. And as I say, people are very angry at corporations. I think that my pet theory is that anger at government has actually displaced anger at corporations, that people deal with their faceless, dehumanizing corporations on an almost daily basis through terrible customer service or getting petty fees that they don't necessarily owe, things like that, much more than their government. But then they lash out at the government because they're so powerless in the face of these corporations. So I think you could have a potent political campaign based on this. Now, the problem, of course, is that how would you fund it? Democrats feel like they need to compete with Republicans. Their funding base is eroded, and so they turn to corporations. So they have different corporations, Google instead of Koch Industries, but they're corporations nonetheless.
Well, of course, Bernie Sanders showed that you can raise $225 million for his presidential campaign in small contributions averaging $27. True. So that the internet is changing the situation here. And also, by the way, you may not know this, we're talking with Jesse Eisinger, the author of The Chicken Shit Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. There is a state senator in one of the poorest areas of West Virginia, which is a very Republican state, giving Trump huge majorities in the last election. And he's running on a campaign to hold big business accountable. His name is Richard Ojeda, a former Iraq and Afghan war veteran, and he's going all out. And he's a state senator. He's running for the House of Representatives in an empty seat, and he has a very good chance of winning. And he's not getting money from these big fat cats. So the more these kinds of campaigns succeed, I think the more you'll get a legislative solution, which will end up in corporate crime legislation and an expansion of corporate crime enforcement budgets for the Justice Department, the Securities Exchange Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency. So once again, it's the Congress, isn't it? It's the Congress. It's the Congress.
I think that's right. And, of course, Congress is not in any mood now to increase corporate accountability. They're moving in the opposite direction, but maybe that could change.
Jesse, one more question you may not have been asked by the media who's interviewed you on this wonderful book is the role of corporate law firms in the corporate crime context, not just defending them, but making sure that budgets in Congress for corporate crime law enforcement are reduced, getting their own people in key positions in the government. When I was at law school, we were told to be critical of everything, judicial decisions and legislation and procedures, except corporate law firms, who most Harvard law students want to work for. And that's the situation today. A report just came out by Pete Davis, a third-year student at Harvard Law School, called the Harvard Law's Bicentennial Crisis. And he got very interesting data that more Harvard Law graduates go to work in New York City, mostly corporate law firms, than Harvard Law graduates go to work in 47 other states. And so you have this law school to corporate law connection that continues to provide the brains and the strategies for these giant corporations to do bad things and to get away with it. What do you think of spending more time by the media on these corporate law firms and having the media stop calling them prestigious white glove law firms? Can you imagine?
I agree with you, and I wish that there was more accountability journalism about big law firms and their enabling of their clients, and that is something I tried to do a little bit in the book and try to identify this, and I want to carry it on. We need to hold these law firms accountable for the kinds of things that they do. You saw Skadden Arp's partner plead guilty in the Mueller and special counsel investigation into Russia and the Trump administration, and they were lying, and Skadden Arps played a major role in enabling Paul Manafort's frauds and deception and kind of hiding it. And so these law firms are ripe for some investigation, and ProPublica, we're going to try to do some of that, but I hope that the media really embraces this.
Well, ProPublica has done some great investigations, which have been printed in some of the major newspapers with whom they've collaborated. I take it the New York Times and Washington Post. Is there ever a follow-up by ProPublica to see whether their investigations of corporate criminal behavior resulted in any changes?
We do. We track the impact from our investigations pretty carefully because, in fact, what our mandate is, our charter is about impact. What we want to do is bring change about through our reporting. It's very difficult to do. It doesn't always happen, but we want to try to do that, and that's our goal. And so, you can look at our annual report to see what our record is.
What's the website? Before we get
the website is propublica.org.
We're talking with Jesse Eisinger of the Chicken Shit Club, author of the Chicken Shit Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. Jesse won the Pulitzer Prize, the highest prize that journalists win in this country by most standards. Steve, do you have a question?
Yes, Jesse, in the wake of the financial crisis, who do you think should have gone to jail or at least been indicted or targeted? Who are some of these people?
Well, my book, I'm not a lawyer, and my book is not a legal brief about specific people, but what I try to show is that they didn't really investigate a lot of people. So I think that there are executives at Lehman Brothers who they didn't investigate adequately, like Dick Fuld, and executives at AIG who they didn't make the right decisions about, like Joseph Cassano. And there are Goldman Sachs bankers who should have been investigated for their CDO business, and I named some of them in the book. So as a non-lawyer in a book, you can't make a specific case against a specific person. That wasn't really my intention. What my intention was is to demonstrate why this is a crisis, what the problems are, and also show that Eric Holder and Preet Bharara, who was the Southern District U.S. Attorney, they say, well, we looked hard at these cases and we didn't see crimes. And I think I show pretty definitively that they didn't look hard and they didn't look hard enough. So I think I proved that that's not true.
On that note, thank you very much, Jesse. We always emphasize people who want to see change in this country can start with their senators and representatives and summon them to their own town meetings on their own agenda and hold them accountable. So thank you very much for authoring this book, Chicken Shit Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives.
Thank you so much for having me. I really had fun.
We have been speaking with Jesse Eisinger, author of The Chicken Shit Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. We will link to that and his other work at ProPublica at ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we come back, we're going to dive into the mailbag. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. You are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Wednesday, September 28, 2018. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, revolutionized the opioid industry through aggressive marketing tactics that encourage the widespread use of prescription painkillers. At the same time, officials at the company attempted to work behind the scenes to make it less likely that they could ever be successfully prosecuted for the carnage opioids were unleashing. That's according to a report in The Intercept. Corporate executives are acutely aware of the looming power of the responsible corporate office doctrine, also known as the Park Doctrine. It's a legal liability standard used largely to prosecute executives at companies responsible for affecting public health and safety. Under the Park Doctrine, federal prosecutors could target senior executives and board members of opioid pharma companies for their role in the sprawling epidemic if violations of criminal law were proved true. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. David, before we get to our listener questions, you had something you wanted to ask Ralph.
Delta Airlines is severing ties with the NRA. Dick's Sporting Goods announced that they are no longer going to sell rifles and guns. They seem to be responding to the free marketplace of ideas and boycotts. Are we seeing corporate responsibility?
I think, David, they're reflecting the majority sentiments of their customers. I mean, the majority of the people in this country understand the importance of the Second Amendment, but they also want better background checks. They want the gun dealer loophole to be closed. They want a ban on weapons of war that can be purchased by 19-year-olds. They want these things, and companies have their finger to the wind. In these areas, the NRA is in a minority, including a majority of NRA members want better background checks, for example.
When we see corporations like Disney speaking out in favor of the gays and lesbian community and supporting same-sex marriage and the environment, is that cosmetic or is it real?
Certainly in the civil rights area, it's real because they don't want to lose customers, and consumers are marching and voting with their feet more than ever before. You have these internet systems, X company sucks, that surrounds a whole bevy of consumer complaints. And more people who are not part of the discriminated class will support the discriminated class and not buy from these companies. I'm waiting for the first example of what you're talking about to confront Amazon. That would really be progress.
Right. But I just worry that it perpetuates the myth of the free market, that there's a free market of ideas and that there actually is a free market in America, which I don't think there really is.
Well, it's recognizing consumer rejection potential. And everybody who sells anything is sensitive to that. If people take their purchases elsewhere to a competitor who is behaving in a way more consonant with the customer's values, that is the best working of the free market, rejection. The same way with politics. If you take your vote from someone who is in public office in Congress and give it to someone else, you're going to get the attention of the incumbent, for sure.
Well, that is actually on the same theme, Ralph, leads to our first listener question. Now, I know the Second Amendment issues are not your specialty, but listener Shad wants to talk about the Second Amendment. And his comment was, what would it take to remove this amendment? And he goes on to say that slave owners at the time, the founding fathers, they weren't worried about government tyranny. They were more worried about slaves running away. And they thought he's thinking that's the impetus for that. And that the NRA uses this amendment as a marketing tool to promote owning a gun as being true American.
Well, the Second Amendment is here to stay because I think the core of it is supported by a lot of people. They want to defend themselves. But it's now being used to justify all kinds of excesses involving guns that are opposed by the majority of the American people. I mean, poll after poll shows that they want much better background checks. Majority want increase the age to 21 of buying a weapon. They want safety locks so that kids don't get a hold of them when the parents are away. They want a ban on weapons of war with unbelievably powerful magazines that can be put in to turn these rifles into machine guns. And that's where the debate is, and that's why I think the corporations are beginning to drop off and no longer give discounts to the NRA members and to do other things that express their disfavor of the excesses and extremism of the leaders of the NRA who pursue policies that are often opposed by a majority of NRA members, like more thorough background checks and waiting periods.
Right. I've done a little bit of reading about the Second Amendment with all of this going on, and I was reading the constitutional scholar Akil Reed Amar, and he claims that the Second Amendment, we just don't understand the 18th century language on both sides of the issues. And the thing that sticks in my mind is the phrase, the right to bear arms. In the 18th century, when this was written, it always was in a military context. It always meant military. It didn't mean self-defense or hunting or sporting. And that's a huge disconnect between the definition that we use in modern right to bear arms versus what they really meant by it back then.
Yes, the Yale law professor Amar made that point in an interview by Phil Donahue at the American Museum of Tort Law in Connecticut a few months ago. He's very well regarded as a historian of the law. However, you know the old saying, the Constitution is what the judges say it is, and a strong 5-4 majority in the Supreme Court of the United States that basically interprets it in a different way than Professor Amar does.
You can't sue gun manufacturers. There's no liability, right? The Supreme Court has ruled, I believe, or Congress passed a law that says victims of gun violence can't sue the people who sold the guns to the shooters.
Yeah, virtual immunity, but now there's an effort in some legislatures to expose the more extreme behavior of gun manufacturers in terms of reckless distribution, marketing, promotion, the outer edges of what might be called gross negligence to the accountabilities of the law of torts. Those proposals are just being put forth now in the wake of all these tragedies.
I'm not trying to be provocative here. The shooter, Cruz, in Florida, would have killed more people had his AR-15 not jammed. Could you theoretically sue the AR-15 manufacturers for the magazine jamming? And I'm not trying to be funny here.
Suits about defects, you can still file suit if your rifle was defective and damaged you. That has not been included in the immunity laws. And by the way, a very large majority of American people want to ban bump stocks, which were used in the Nevada tragedy. So you got to take it piece by piece and see what can be legislated, reflecting the vast majority of sensible people in this country who recognize the value of the Second Amendment, and they're hunters, and they want weapons for self-defense, but they also know if it goes too far, the backlash can be terrible in terms of casualties, fear, dread, anxiety, and other chaos.
All right. This question comes from Athena Athen. And she says, more and more students in colleges and universities are now obligated to submit their assignments through an online service called Blackboard. Although Blackboard states that it respects students' privacy rights, it also states what Blackboard does with the information it collects. Also, please be aware that advertisers or websites that are linked to the services may collect personally identifiable information about you. The information practices of those websites linked to the services are not covered by this privacy policy, and Blackboard is not responsible for the privacy practices or the contents of such websites. What this means is I pay for my education, she's saying, and my school contract with providers such as Blackboard, and she's subject to having her info sold. Please help.
This is going to be a continuing problem as the internet structures intrude on our educational institutions and schools. I think the administrators are being sold a bill of goods here. They're losing the protection of privacy over their students. I suggest that Athena Athen contact Professor Robert Fellmeth, Fellmeth, at University of San Diego Law School, who's been looking into some of these invasions of privacy for a long time. That's F as in Frank, Ellmeth, University of San Diego Law School.
This next question is a response to the interview we did with David K. Johnston a few weeks back. And towards the beginning of the show, David K. Johnston talked about Donald Trump's relationship with Russia. This is from our listener, Nick Zacharias, and he took exception to this. Here's a question, he writes. With the Russia narrative having no actual evidence to support it, the Russia gave WikiLeaks emails, things still isn't proven, and the content of said emails of controversy was proof the primary was rigged against Bernie, and that's more the fault of Hillary and the Dems for cheating in the first place, but whatever. And that it's been used to smear leftist figures and causes like Bernie Sanders, Jill Stein, BLM, and that I haven't even heard Ralph challenge the narrative in the past. What the F is Ralph suddenly sounding more and more like another Trump does Russia stuff pedant lately?
Nick, it is true. There is harassment of the third party's effort, but he submitted this question before the of 13 Russian figures by the Mueller investigation, which showed pretty much undeniable interference in our elections. Of course, the U.S. interferes in a lot of other elections around the world, but aside from that, they did. They were very, very thorough about it. When they saw a rally that favored the candidate or opposed the candidate, they publicized it more. And so they learned about who was doing what against what candidates and for candidates, and they got their licks in. And there's really very little doubt about that. So that is something that Nick should recognize. As far as any conspiracy or collusion with Trump himself, that is yet to be seen one way or the other with the development of the Mueller investigation in the weeks to come. But we've got to be really concerned about all kinds of external forces getting into the software of the voting machines and spreading really terrible lies about candidates which can never be corrected, and manipulating forces in electoral politics who don't even know they're being manipulated because of the reach of the internet.
Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming either on Ralph's Facebook page or on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website or on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Facebook page. And you can also find us on YouTube now. I want to thank again our guest today, Jesse Eisinger, author of The Chicken Shit Club.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when our guest is Nassim Nicholas Taleb, author of Skin in the Game. Thank you, Ralph.
Thanks. See you next week.
I think you should step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up. Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been saying way too long. Stand up. Step up. I think you should step up. Rise up. And you rise up because you have the power.